people would pull out their food stamps and the people around them would judge them. And I'm just like, why? Why would you judge them for, doing what they need to do to survive? I don't there's definitely a negative connotation with being on welfare and also getting food stamps. I don't know. I don't understand why that is.
Yeah, I would agree. I remember using food stamps. This is so funny. So I used food stamps when I moved out of my house when I was 18, and I used them in Georgia, and I didn't really feel like I was being judged. But when I came back to California, after some time, and I was living in California, and I got food stamps because I was struggling to make a living. I was out of the military, out of a job, and had like a new apartment. So I got food stamps, and I lived in a bougier part of California. And I remember when I got food stamps, that was the first time I was ever judged for using food stamps. Like I had people staring at me when I was using food stamps. So that was very interesting. Did you have some of that judgment as well?
Yeah, it's even though we were all poor, there was still, and most of us were on food stamps. There was still some kind of judgment between the people that weren't on food stamps and the people that were on food stamps. Um, uh, I don't know why there's a stigma behind it, but there was definitely judgment. There was definitely judgment between the people that weren't on food stamps and the people that were. And even worse when you went outside of the community, and like I would be when I was working in downtown, the people would pull out their food stamps and the people around them would judge them. And I'm just like, why? Why would you judge them for, doing what they need to do to survive? I don't there's definitely a negative connotation with being on welfare and also getting food stamps. It, I don't know. I don't understand why that is.
So before we go any further, I want to discuss what is law. Um, Essentially, I want to talk about the definition of law, and this is just from like a really quick Google search. And it says that law is a system of rules which a particular country or community recognizes as regulating the actions of its members and which it may enforce by the imposition of penalties, which the definition by itself is even hard to understand. So, like, imagine if you're someone who didn't have like the best education growing up. That in itself is already hard to understand.
Yeah, that's why they call it legalese. Because
Yeah,
that's why there's a whole term for it. It's a whole different language that doesn't make sense to the common.
the common person.
Yeah.
So, there's this correlation between law and rights. Usually, when you talk about law, you talk about rights and vice versa. But
Hmm.
I feel like rights don't always correlate with law because you think law as like a justified system and you think of rights as also something that's justified. Like you should have legal rights, which is essentially what it is, a right. A legal right is still a right.
Yeah.
But there's rights, and then there's the legal system, and sometimes they do separate. And sometimes your rights don't really touch the legal system because for whatever reason, your race, your class, whatever. Sometimes your rights are not always there.
Hmm.
So in your opinion, what do you consider rights? How do you see rights?
I think of rights as things or actions that are inherently given to you as a human being. Like if there's there's a certain aspect of life that you're guaranteed just for existing. I think that's what I think of when I think of rights. And then laws, I would say that those are rules that help delineate exactly how far out your rights actually stretch out, because you don't want people to just be out there doing everything that they want to do. You know,
Mm-hmm.
that's not how you make a functioning society.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in the same breath as well, the law is supposed to protect your rights, which it doesn't always do that either, you
Yeah.
know? So, going off of rights, looking at our history of America, looking at the legal system, we're going to get into a topic that is pretty heavy. And that topic is going to be slavery, where essentially all rights were just thrown out the window for African Americans who came to this continent, came by force, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to talk about slavery and its correlation with rights, and how you feel that also correlates with your time in Chicago. Do you feel like some of the way that slavery destroyed rights, or the way that slavery was used to take away people's rights, do you see that same kind of mentality happening in Chicago still?
I think so. I think there's still some remnants of racism in Chicago, just because there's there everyone's poor for the most part, and everyone there is African American, and so most of the crime is happening those communities. So some of the police there, the ones that don't use their brain, kind of assume that anyone who's African American is, guilty of something. It doesn't matter if they have any evidence or anything. They must be guilty of something. And definitely encountered that. I mean, just the example I gave earlier, where it was commonplace for people to just get stopped and searched for quote unquote weed, and nobody said anything. Nobody. I didn't know that was a right that I had. The police officer was violating my rights by stopping me for no reason and searching me and my friends. Like I didn't know anything about illegal search and seizure.
Yeah, and it could be said too that he was assuming that you wouldn't know because of the color of your skin, or, maybe he was judging you based on like how you looked, like, oh, because he looks either Hispanic or African American. He's located in Southside Chicago, or he's in a not very good neighborhood that you probably wouldn't know the legal system, so he's going to exploit that. I could definitely see that happening as well.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that going on, where uh, evidence being planted, people being arrested for disorderly conduct or resisting arrest, and then it always, when they finally do investigations and they find out this person never actually did anything, then they always just fall back on, well, they did actually resist arrest. If they would have just let the officer, arrest them, even though they did nothing wrong, because the officer was having a bad day or was just being racist. It That happens a lot, especially not so as much now, but definitely when I was growing up, that would happen a lot.
That's kind of talked about in the book Alchemy of Race and Rights by Patricia Williams. She actually discusses the nature of laws, rights, and race. Specifically, she dives into rights and how they attributed to history or the cause of rights issues in the African American community. And she talks about on page 159, she quotes, "This underscores my sense of the importance of rights. Rights are to law what conscious commitments are to the psyche. This country's works, historical moments have not been attributable to rights assertion, but to a failure of rights commitment." What she's saying in that statement is that though law and rights do correlate with each other, it's not always the case where the law will uphold those rights. Same thing with like commitments to the psyche. And there's a lot of historical moments in the US history that show that rights were not given to everyone, like an example earlier, which was slavery. And that's still happening in today's world. Like you were just talking about in Chicago, where officers would search and seizure, but they have no reason to. But you didn't understand that, right? Like there was no legal education in your part. And so, in some ways, some of that ideology of slavery, where we can do what we want with these slaves because they don't understand rights, they don't understand their own human anatomy, like they don't understand like their worth, and so we can use that against them and make them feel like they're lesser beings and that they have no rights. And it's kind of the same thing in Chicago, not just with the law enforcement, but like with big companies, big corporate. They go after people that they feel like don't understand, legal rights in general, and they use that against you. And because they're like, they don't understand. So there's a parallel to where an officer sees you, sees the color of your skin, and he thinks in his head, oh, well, I can do what I want with this guy because he doesn't understand the legal rights because he's black or he's Mexican or something like that.
Yeah, the more I think about it, the more I realize, because my best friend growing up was Cuban, but he looked Caucasian. So he never had any of these problems. He walked to and from school without any issues. But me and my other friends who were obviously brown, we got stopped all the time. They just did. The more I think about it, the more I realize, yeah, he didn't have to deal with this, but he was not Caucasian. He just looked Caucasian.
Yeah. I mean, the biases are there as soon as you see someone, so you don't even know all the information about them, but you're already creating an image in your mind of like who they are. You've experienced this in the American culture, right? You experience all of this in the American culture, but you're also from Mexico. You spent some time in Mexico. You frequently go down to Mexico. Do you experience the same thing that you have in the US down in Mexico with the same mindset or a different mindset?
It's the same. I think it's the same, and I think it's worse. Because Mexico, not only is Mexico culturally about 20 years behind the US, you can tell that by the TV shows that they watch. They're watching TV shows from 20 years ago, and they're loving them now. But the culture there's because there was slaves that were taken to Mexico. There's dark-skinned Mexicans and there's light-skinned Mexicans, and light-skinned Mexicans have always looked down on dark-skinned Mexicans, and it's I say it's worse because they will actually talk about people's skin color being ugly because they're darker skin tone.
So there's racism down there.
Yeah, there's racism down there, but it's not subtle racism. It's not unbeknownst. It's outward racism. Like there's even a political party called Blackie. Like their political party is Blackie, and their whole reason for existence is to fight for rights for people that are darker skin tone, and they're called Negrito. And that name, I think they chose that name because that's the name that keeps being given to them. But I feel like that name, calling yourself Blackie as a political party to fight for your rights, it's symbolic in a way, but I feel like that's not the name that you